Trek favorites. What are yours? Welcome to Trek Favorites. I'm Chuck Joyner, and this is a show where you get to hear from some of my tech friends and my Trek friends about some of their favorite episodes of one of the Star Trek series. We don't ask them to pick a favorite because that's pretty much impossible, but we ask them to pick a favorite. And it doesn't really matter why it's a favorite of theirs, just that it struck a chord with them. This time, I am delighted to welcome Steve Sheridan to the show. Steve, it's good to see you. I really appreciate you being here.
Hello, Chuck. It's very good to see you again. Thanks for having me on Trek Favorites. You know, as much as I dislike being in front of a camera and a mic, I've been looking forward to this, so I have to give that to you.
I'm glad I was able to tempt you out of the shadows.
Pleasure to be here.
So, as always, we're not going to give a full recap or anything of the show. There's a link in the show notes to Memory Alpha, and of course, you can go and watch this episode on wherever Star Trek is available at the given moment that you're watching this show. Steve picked episode 10, season 6. Actually, it's a two-parter, 10 and 11 of season 6, Chain of Command. And I have to tell you, Steve, this is one that I would put on my list, or these two would be two of the ones that would go on my list of Trek favorites. Why? What is it about this, though, that appealed to you?
So before I get into that, let me just make two comments if I can. First, I want to thank you for the format of Trek favorites because you've said many times you don't have to pick the favorite. You can pick one of your favorites. Of course, we all have many favorites. And that came real in handy because a week or two ago, someone beat me to my first choice, Martellero. And so I just was able to move on to another one of my favorites. And I'm not bitter at all that my favorite was picked by John. But
the fact that you bring it up means you're not bitter at all, right?
Exactly. But I really enjoyed the how you and John went over the inner light. One thing I wanted to add about that I didn't hear stated, which I thought was a really cool thing, in the inner light, Kamen's son, Batai, is played by Patrick Stewart's son.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and I thought that was a nice head nod to his own true son to allow him to be in the episode. Anyway, that's behind us. The other thing I want to do before we get into why I picked this is I like to remind people what the episode is who probably have seen it but can't really connect the title to the episode. So this is the one where it's a two-part episode, as you said. So Captain Picard's relieved of command by Starfleet to go take on a special covert mission. So he and Crusher and Worf go to investigate a metagenic weapon that Starfleet believes the Cardassians are developing. And in the meantime, Captain Edward Jellicoe has taken over for Picard with a much different management style, much to the dismay of the Enterprise crew. And we take it from there. That should jog your memory if you have seen the episode but can't recall the title.
That's interesting that you would take it that way, because to me this was always the one where Picard was tortured.
Yes,
that would have been my mnemonic device.
That certainly stands out, and that brings up an interesting point about this pair of episodes. Part one focuses so much on the transition of the command from Picard to Jellicoe, Captain Jellicoe, as well as the away team going off and investigating the metagenic weapon. But part two, it focuses so much on the torture of Picard by his villain that we'll get into, I'm sure. And it's almost like they're two different episodes, strongly connected, but much different feel to the two.
Agreed. So is it, since you described it the way you did, is it the change in management style, the change of command, and the resulting let's say turmoil, was that it, or was it the idea that it's Picard and Crusher and Worf are relieved for a secret mission, or what?
So why I picked the episode? It's three primary reasons. By now, we're well into the Next Generation series, season 6, and so we know the characters really well. We know their characteristics, and this episode, I like how Jellicoe taking on command of the Enterprise kind of highlights those Enterprise crew members' characteristics and almost mocks them in some ways. For instance, Deanna's sensitive, caring approach about the crew's feelings to Jellicoe, trying to get him to maybe change his style, and Jellicoe just hit with his abrupt style, just saying, "Why don't you just take care of it, smooth it over," and he and Riker, it points out such management style differences with Riker and even more so Picard. So I like how Jellicoe's style brings out the Enterprise crew characteristics that we all know and love. The main reason I really like this episode is the acting of several of the actors. Ronnie Cox, who plays Captain Jellicoe, and Jonathan Frakes, I thought did fantastic jobs. But Patrick Stewart and the guy who plays his torturer, Gul Madred, are just superb. And the acting of those two and the interplay between them, I think, just puts this episode at a whole different level than many of the others. And the third reason I like this is because this is the episode that developed one of the most iconic lines in Star Trek: "There are 4 lights," and that kind of epitomizes a lot of what Captain Picard, how he deals with his torturer.
Okay, I want to come back to the 4 lights thing, but we'll do that a little bit later. But let's deal with the first episode of the 2, or the first part of this. I have to tell you, I absolutely enjoy this because I feel like I have lived some of that in certain office transitions from manager to manager. And, exactly who was playing what role, we're not going to get into that. And I'm not going to call any names. But it is sort of amazing how a situation like that can just completely change and disrupt an operation that was running completely smoothly. And arguably it can be made to run smooth again under the new regime. But boy, there are times just like, aren't you paying any attention to how well things were going? And there's a reason that these people were in their positions, and there's a reason that this is the flagship of Starfleet, and you're going to come in and just run roughshod all over it?
Yes, and I have been in those situations, maybe not quite as severe with Jellicoe's style, but polar opposite command styles between Picard and Jellicoe, and just seeing the crew try to adapt to that new management style is at times fun and at times uncomfortable. But it does point out something that I thought was interesting, which is whether Jellicoe is actually the right guy for the right job at that time. And because he comes off as a bad guy sometimes, but when I see the entire episode in total and I look back, I kind of think maybe he was the right fellow for this job. He was the right person to lead the Enterprise at that time. I'm not saying Captain Picard couldn't have done it or couldn't have done it better, but there are certain aspects about Jellicoe's command style and his knowledge of the Cardassians that really came into play and helped this mission, I think.
That's a really interesting observation. Definitely, he makes his style effective.
Yes.
I too have been through negotiations with people that like to play that negotiating game. Make somebody wait for half an hour, and then have the blustering approach to things, and then have a third party come in. The way he had Riker and Deanna go in and calm him down and say, this is a loose cannon. The good cop, bad cop thing,
right?
Is really what it was.
Yeah, and I believe it worked pretty well in this case with the Cardassian that he was dealing with. I think it was Gul Lamek. who he was negotiating with. But you have to ask, because he's not really a participative manager, he's more just a command style without taking much input. How long would that last with the crew? And that's why I think Picard is a better captain overall, but there may be isolated situations where that management style of Jellicoe's could come into play.
I think great point. And in a more militaristic environment, it may be very much because Picard's command style was quite different, obviously. And was it a command style? Yeah, it was, because the crew respected him. They gave input, but at the end of the day, Picard was the one that got to make the decision. Jellicoe barely took any input from anyone, just made the decision, and then wanted it done. And if it didn't get done, then there were problems.
Right. And I think that there's danger to that, not shutting down input. I think there's value to getting input from your crew. And in fact, if that happens too long, I think it's detrimental to the mission. But in this isolated case, Jellicoe was confident enough, at least he gave that aura, that he thought he could do this, and it turns out he was able to carry it off.
Well, if you think back to when Picard, the Admiral walked in and Nechayev said, "I'm here to relieve you." I mean, her style was almost mirroring Jellicoe's. Very abrupt, very direct. No question, no input. This is the way it's going to be, and it's going to be this way right now.
Yes. I don't know who learned from who. Maybe Jellicoe learned from Nechayev. But interesting point about Vice Admiral Nechayev. She makes her first appearance in this episode, and she does appear in several later episodes of both The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. So we're used to seeing her, but I'd forgotten this is where she first makes her appearance.
As I recall, as time went on, her character softened up a little bit and became a bit more not conversational, I guess, but at least there were more exchanges. Or maybe I'm just reading this whole thing completely wrong.
Well, I definitely think that she does soften over the several episodes she appears on. She's very much hardlined by the book, like Jellicoe when she first appears. I think it's interesting because most admirals do not come off very well on Star Trek. Many of them are just not good people, or they make poor decisions. And to Nechayev's credit, she ends up being, I think, one of the better admirals in Starfleet. She ends up making some decisions. Occasionally we may disagree, but I get the feeling she does care about the people under her command, and that she really is trying to do the right thing, although maybe with a hard line once in a while. Then again, she's an admiral. Maybe that's how she got there.
That's equally a fair point. That at some point maybe you can't be a friendly admiral.
Yeah,
not sure what that means. So and the one other thing too I feel like I want to mention is that Riker and Jellicoe have a really interesting exchange in Riker's quarters.
Oh yeah.
But it points out to me, it pointed out the fact that, okay, you can, if you are in this kind of situation, you can still work toward a common goal with the individual, even if you acknowledge that neither one of you like each other very much, if you can agree on the objective. And at the end of the day, Jellicoe was in charge, and this was going to be his strategy. Whether Riker agreed with that or not, that never seemed to be explored. It's just, okay, this is what's going to be done. Riker's the best man for the job, and they both got past their personal differences to let him do it.
Yeah, you're referring to when Jellicoe needs Riker to pilot the shuttle into the nebula to plant the mines.
Right.
And that was a really interesting exchange because, Jellicoe opens up by saying, let's drop rank here. And then they get into personal exchanges of how they view each other's management styles, which gets pretty specific. But in the end, as you point out, Jellicoe and Riker come to an agreement That is that Riker, who is the best pilot, needs to fly that shuttle into the nebula, plant the mines. But I think Riker kind of gets he kind of gets the I don't know about the last word when Jellicoe says, I can't command you to take the shuttle and to pilot this shuttle, and then Riker just says, then ask me, and of course he asks him, and Riker acknowledges. Jellicoe doesn't acknowledge that Riker has said yes, walks out, and and then subtly says, "You're welcome."
Yeah, very, very subtly.
Yeah, because there was no thank you in that departure by Jellicoe.
Steve, did you think that the selection of Picard, Riker, and the Doctor, whose name just slid right out of my head, which I know better than that, Crusher, thank you. Do you think it made sense for them to be this strike team for this alleged lab?
At first, I was questioning why they picked those three. I guess I could see picking Captain Picard, but why Worf and why Dr. Crusher? And I think they did make it clear later, Worf for his security, brawn, if you will, and Crusher because they were dealing with this potential metagenic weapon that they were after, and there may be injuries as a result of this mission. So they explained it, but I don't know if I would have picked those three initially, Dr. Crusher specifically.
Now, see, that's interesting because I would have said, okay, Crusher seemed to have some familiarity with metagenics. Worf, Worf is like the ultimate soldier, so why wouldn't you? Picard was the one I questioned because it seemed like the message, the mission was pretty well defined. That this is what you're going to do. You're going to infiltrate this, and then Crusher's going to take over, and Worf is the muscle.
Well, I think there was a reason, and that was Captain Picard's familiarity with Theta Band carrier waves from his time on one of his early starships. I think what was that? The Stargazer. He had some experience with Theta Band emissions, and that's what drew them into this metagenic lab they thought they were going into.
You're right. I'd forgotten that was alluded to.
But they did have to explain why those three were selected. In actuality, I think they selected Picard because the actor behind Picard is Stewart, and he's the best one to play those torture scenes.
Well, and it also, if you were going to put together a team like that, it would make sense that if you had a team that already existed as part of a larger team, but that clearly is they were familiar with each other, they knew each other's reactions in certain situations. There would be some value in that too from a strategic standpoint.
Right. And they certainly did train hard for the mission.
Yeah. Yeah. Not too often that you see Picard coming in, putting his feet up on the table and just looks like he wants to go to sleep.
Yeah. And Riker had the thoughtfulness of when he walked in to try and get some information from Picard about what was going on. He saw how beat Captain Picard was and just said, never mind. We can talk about this later.
Which really was a very subtle acknowledgement of the respect that Riker had for Picard. That, okay, obviously you're beat up and, we're over here miserable with Jellicoe, but you have bigger problems. And one of them is staying awake. Yeah,
I think it did show incredible respect.
So why don't we shift over to the torture sequence, the torture sequences? Because I think those are a highlight. I mean, once again, Patrick Stewart just shows himself to be an amazing actor.
Oh, no doubt. And his torturer, David Warner, who plays the Gul Madrid. By the way, I think the name was chosen well. Madrid, he's the guy you dread when you come up against. Gul Madrid is the torturer. And I have to say, Stewart does such a convincing job acting as the person being tortured, Captain Picard. But David Warner has this real low level, kind of a low level, low key way of conveying his message, which to me, it enhances how menacing he is to Picard. And I think their interaction is a work of beauty.
I agree completely. I mean, it's amazing that we're sitting here talking about a torture scene as being a thing of beauty, but it really is. It was interesting to watch the discussions go from borderline academic, where the two of them are trading archaeological discussion, to that torturer-victim kind of relationship, and then see Picard rebelling or fighting back against that too, and succeeding to some degree.
Yes, that came out a few times, both when they're talking about the archaeological items on their planet, on the Cardassian planet, as well as the egg that he was offering, the breakfast. But I viewed that as Gul Madred kind of using a carrot stick approach, where he would get Picard's hopes up and then dash them as part of the psychological impact of torture.
But Picard twisted that back around and said, I always see you as what a 3-year-old boy or 6-year-old boy or whatever. And that just threw Madred into rage.
Yes, which kind of speaks to the spirit of Captain Picard. A couple times he does that, where he doesn't give in to the torture. He's rebelling against it, as you said. That was one time. Another time that I thought really stood out was when Gul Madred brings his daughter into the torture room, which is kind of odd. Captain Picard notes that, and Gul Madred tries to explain, why she's there, why he wants her to see this. And I think, I wrote the line down. Picard then says something to the effect that your daughter's belly may be full, but her spirit will be empty as a result of seeing all this. And Madred slaps him across the face. So you can see that he's getting under his torturer's skin. He's rebelling and not giving in.
The other interesting thing was, it shows the Picard character's strength of character when, okay, you're free to go. We'll get what we need from the human woman. And Picard chooses to stay.
Yes.
Even though, it's obviously manipulation, but just in case it's not, he decides he feels the need to stay.
Exactly. Picard, the part he plays is pretty impressive. I read up that Picard had studied video from Amnesty International of, I assume, torture. I'm not sure how explicit it was. And, to kind of bone up on what it's like to be tortured, I assume. And that he insisted on playing that first torture scene where Picard's hanging by his hands. He insisted to play that without clothing, naked, in a closed set. But he was very insistent on that. And I believe, again, to get across how vulnerable someone who's being tortured can be.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But again, so very much in keeping with Patrick Stewart and his dedication to the craft.
Very much so. I also, about the torture, I thought Star Trek made a pretty strong statement about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of torture. Patrick Stewart Picard pretty much came out and said, torture has never been a reliable means of extracting information. It is ultimately self-defeating as a means of gaining control. One wonders why it's still practiced. And that is, I think that kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of what one of the messages they may have been trying to get across in this episode.
Yeah, and the fact that you've already injected me with drugs, so I've told you everything.
Exactly. And even after that, Gul Madred starts to, I think, take pleasure in or relish the task of torturing Picard, because he knows Picard doesn't have the information about Mino Corvus, the planet that the Federation was trying to defend. But even so, even though he knows Picard doesn't have this information, he continues to torture him, and he continues to try and get him to say there are 5 lights when there are actually 4. So it's well beyond something that he's doing as a job or a profession. He's doing this, what appears to be for personal reasons now. That's what I took away from that scene or those scenes.
Okay, there's one thing that I want to bring up that is probably going to be controversial, and it's strictly my potential interpretation. But the 4-light thing at the very end. Okay, skip to the very end of the second episode when Picard is sitting with Deanna and saying, basically, I would have told him anything because I believed I could see there were 5 lights.
Mm-hmm.
If you noticed, you never saw the 4 lights in the final sequence.
Oh.
And if I were a torturer, I'd have put a 5th light up there just to mess with them. And so, and I've watched it like 6 times. I watched those last scenes, but I also watched Madred's expression at the very end, and I can't quite decide whether I think I see a little hint of a smile or not.
I did not notice that.
Well, was it a smile because he respected Picard, for standing up under it and not giving in, even though there was one final deception attempt at the very end? Or had he put up 5 lights and Picard was saying there are 4, and Madred is thinking, I broke him, I got him. I don't know. That's going to be a very unpopular comment, I'm sure, with anybody that is a Picard fan. But I just have to wonder, and it also, I looked at the craft of the storytelling and the video. You never saw in that scene 4 lights. You didn't see 5, but you didn't see any number of lights. They were just there, and you assumed there were 4.
You're talking about the final scene. The
final scene, yes.
Yeah,
at one point, there definitely are 4.
Yeah. I didn't read it that way, although I guess I could see how, and I didn't even notice that you couldn't see the explicit number of lights. But when I saw it a couple times, I assumed there were still 4, and it was just Picard's, even though Picard may have been seeing 5 and his mind was starting to play tricks with him, I just assumed it was Picard's strength of character, that he did not want to deliver the information that Gul Madred wanted. Even if he saw 5, he wasn't going to say 5 because he knew Madred wanted to hear it. And that was it. That was the only reason. But if Madred really had 5 lights, Chuck, you're starting to think like a torturer.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I have friends that would agree with that. No, I thought of it, but I guess my point was, as much as anything, that the craft of the storytelling, that if you wanted to contemplate that possibility, it was a possibility, that it was not explicitly shown at that point that there were 4 lights. And I love that, because for me, it left it just open-ended enough that I had a question in my mind.
You've got a good point. In fact, I'm going to be going back and watching this episode right as soon as we're done here, especially the end scene. That's a good point.
You've gave me homework, because now I got to go back and watch Inner Light again to see Patrick Stewart's son. So we're even.
All right.
I guess the last thing we have to address is, once the mines were planted and Jellicoe's very brusque, direct confrontation with the Cardassians and saying, this is what I have, and he proved it to them, and are you going to fold or not? And they folded like a cheap lawn chair.
Yes, they did, and he had a great line. I love the line. I mean, this is one of the things that, to me, points out he might have been the right guy for the right job, or for that job at the time. Right after the mines are planted, he gets Gul, maybe Lamech, back on the line, and simply states, I'm not going to argue with you, Gul Lamech. Every one of your ships has a mine on its belly. My finger's on the button, and you're in a very bad position. That was, very well, very strategically done. Used his resources, used Riker to plant those mines, got the Cardassians, actually knew they were there. Actually, let me go back on that. Who was it that figured out that the Cardassians were assembling in the nebula? That wasn't Jellicoe, was it? I think that was some of the other crew members. Maybe it was LaForge and Data.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can credit Jellicoe to that.
No, but I know that at one point, Data and Geordi were the ones that determined or came up with an idea of where they might be. I think I've got
Yeah.
that right.
Yeah, I think they did. But once they knew where they were, it was Jellicoe's plan to plant those mines, and very effective plan.
Yeah.
And he did it well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The very last, well, not the very last scene, but when Picard retook command of the Enterprise and Jellicoe kind of bows out, I mean, you almost felt sorry for him. At least I did, because he had been so disliked up to that point, and it was clear that everybody on that bridge was glad to see him go.
Yeah, you could hear a collective sigh of relief as he leaves the bridge, and it's not like he expected anything, but it was a summary. He just basically departed ways very quickly. Although he did have a line: "Here's your ship back, just the way you left it, maybe a little better."
Yeah.
Some might disagree, but I have to point out there is one lasting impact that Jellicoe had on the Enterprise crew. There's a scene earlier in the episode, maybe in part one, where Jellicoe orders Deanna to start wearing a standard uniform rather than her I don't know, low cut outfit. And she does, starting in this episode and for the rest of the Next Generation series. She wears a standard uniform.
Really?
Yes.
I mean, obviously, I know she wears that uniform later, but I didn't realize that this was a turning point.
Yeah, there are a couple instances before where she wears a standard uniform. I think it may be in the pilot or the first episode, and some of the other dream sequences, but she pretty consistently wears the standard Starfleet uniform. So Jellicoe had a lasting impact.
Oh, that's interesting. So maybe a little better than you left it. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it was worth it, but it did get Cardassians out of Cormos, Minos, whatever that planet is, and it did rescue Picard.
Absolutely. And again, just one last thing, since we're kind of beating on it a little bit. When the original transition of command happened, it was very ceremonial. When they went back, and look, I know it's TV, all right. They were probably pressed for time, but there was no ceremony. There was no thing. It's just, I relieve you, sir. I stand relieved. Been an honor serving with you. Out the door. No formal ceremonies, no dress uniforms, none of that happened at the first ceremony.
That's right. Very much by the book. I got the impression they had the formal ceremony in the beginning because the crew really needed to hear and see that a new captain was on board and taking control. Maybe not so much when Picard returned. I think they would take that one a lot easier than the first change in command.
Yeah, throughout a lot of the Star Trek series, there are references, either explicit or implicit, that there's a sense of family on the bridge. And Jellicoe makes very clear that he prefers a sense of formality on the bridge, and that kind of rings true with some of the experiences I've had with management changes. Everybody's one big happy family and their team, and others, like, clearly this is the guy calling the shots, and everybody else is not. Yeah,
that was a contrast in their styles, and I have to go back to the difference between commanding a mission that is militaristic in nature versus a many-year mission, which is not just militaristic, but exploratory as well, with people you essentially live with. So I can see why their command styles would be different, and why they may be more effective in one situation versus another.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I really had not exactly thought of it in those terms. So maybe you're right. Maybe Jellicoe was the right guy for this particular mission.
I still wouldn't want to work for the guy.
Amen. 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 Yeah. Been there, done that. No, I don't want to do it either.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Steve, thank you so much. I mean, this has happened with every episode, and I keep saying this, but I think I know the episode. I think I've kind of contemplated as many things as I can about it, and then a guest comes on and just shows me things that now I want to go back and rewatch all of it again to sort of look at it through your eyes a little bit.
Yeah, and that's why I like watching Trek. Well, and more listening than watching Trek Favorites, because I always catch something, at least one thing or one aspect, and often many that I hadn't noticed about an episode. So that causes me to go back and take another peek at it and view it from another perspective.
Yeah, I'm fascinated the many interpretations of even just an episode or two, in this case, like this, that we can see such different things, and maybe sometimes we fill in gaps that are or aren't there with our own interpretations. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's fun. It's fun. So if folks want to get in touch with you, maybe to challenge some of your comments or affirm them, what's the best place for them to do it?
Probably the best place to reach me is on Twitter at SP, as in Peter, Sheridan.
Great. Steve, thank you. I want you back on Trek Favorites again. This has been way too much fun. And I know you have at least a couple other favorites that you'd like to talk about.
Yes, I do, Chuck. And I hope you'll have me back, because I had a good time. And I'm sure there are other favorites out there that I might be willing to talk about.
Yeah, I'm just sorry you got your first one stolen, but you really did a good job with this one. So.
No, I'm fine about that.
John Moderlero, don't turn your back on Steve.
Yeah, I'll catch you someday.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you, Chuck. It was fun.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Trek Favorites. I would be really interested to hear your opinions about our interpretations of these two episodes. Please drop a note on our Facebook page. You can reach us on Twitter as @TrekFavorites. And I'm Chuck at TrekFavorites.com if you want to send an email. But we would love to hear from you. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for joining us. Visit TrekFavorites.com to access all our shows, watch the video versions on our YouTube channel, and connect with us on Twitter and Facebook as @TrekFavorites.